Hundreds of candles filled the great hall of Windfort Castle, while the stained glass windows let in the gentle light. Prince Edward, the heir to the throne, created a solemn and grand scene with the late afternoon light. Throne was waiting for his future wife at the altar for the scheduled ceremony. In order to maintain peace and power, two kingdoms had formed a strategic alliance months before. Edward, a 28-year-old man, was renowned for his valor in combat and his composed approach to royal obligations. He had been raised with the crown's weight on his shoulders, always aware that his life would be. Despite being respected for his leadership and intelligence, those closest to him knew that he was devoted to the kingdom, that the prince was uneasy within and had little control over his own life because of the forced marriage to this load included Princess Eleanor of the far-off region of Venor, whom Edward hardly knew, but who was the subject of his bride, rumors. They weren't supportive. Eleanor was described as a young lady with a peculiar appearance. It was murmured in court that the person was oddly reticent and always wore a veil when appearing in public. That she wasn't a pretty woman, and maybe that's why she didn't fully express herself to Your Highness the King. Advisor muttered as she approached the prince. "I'm coming," and Edward just nodded. Face unimpressed. He had never wanted marriage and had not anticipated love. Passion, only the security of his realm, but he was plagued by a gloom of fear. The doors to the ballroom slowly opened, and he wondered who this woman would be with for the rest of his life. Everyone's attention was on Princess Eleanor, the bride, who was wearing a beautiful white gown, walked in with deliberate, calm steps, and according to hearsay, her face was concealed with a thin veil that is sufficiently thick to conceal her features and the ballroom's ambiance. The intrigue surrounding her entrance hovered in the air, making it seem as though everyone was expecting something more. As his wife drew closer, the prince observed her every action. There was something special about her, presence that piqued his interest. Eleanor appeared unfazed by the event's grandeur or the critical looks. Things surrounds her. She strolled with a confident demeanor and a solid posture when she eventually reached the altar, and, without uttering a word, stood behind Edward. The veil still had her face covered, and the wedding was a clear sign of their stress. Went on, and the mystery surrounding. The princess and prince, who had first felt awed, as though he were in the company of someone he could not have predicted from this wedding. Comprehend the Archbishop's opening remarks for the ceremony, and despite Edward's efforts to concentrate on what was happening, the woman by his side diverted his attention, and he pondered what life might be like with someone he hardly knew, someone who seemed to conceal her actual identity from him and the rest of the world. When the ceremony began, the Archbishop, following custom, turned to the bride and stated, "Princess Eleanor now has to take off her veil and show her true self to her prince and the entire country." All eyes were on her, holding their breath, anticipating what had been kept a secret for so long. Edward, for his part, felt he, like everyone else, prayed that the stories were real as they sent shivers down his spine. Knowing that his bride's look needed to be concealed, Eleanor gently reached up and grasped the edges of the veil. The room fell still as she started to lift the cloth. There was a little tenseness in the crowd before the veil was eventually withdrawn. A whisper was heard, and then there was a startled quiet. Edward remained motionless, his eyes wide. Beneath the veil, Eleanor was unlike anything they had seen, and it left him stunned. Described, there were no abnormalities or disagreeable characteristics. On the contrary, although she was beautiful, Her features were striking and unique in a way that struck a balance between her eyes were deep set, as though they contained the secrets of a lifetime, and she exuded strength and delicacy. The prince sensed the serene, even mysterious grin that defined her lips. He didn't know what he had anticipated when the thaw world fell apart. But it most definitely wasn't this way Eleanor looked at him. Directly in the eye, without hesitation, and without any timidity or fear. On the contrary, her look suggested that she was evaluating him, as though she, Edward, was certain that this would be the start of something far more significant than a straightforward arranged marriage. Was confronted with something for the first time after spending his entire life in control of his destiny, totally out of his hands, and he realized then that his life would never. Edward's astonishment had not yet subsided as the castle hall spoke. To everyone's surprise, Princess Eleanor was completely different from what the prince stood whispering in the rumors, unsure of what to think for a few moments. But Eleanor maintained her unwavering, almost rebellious gaze because she understood the impact. After a moment of silence, her expression remained serene despite what she'd caused. Even though there was tension in the air, the archbishop carried on with the ceremony. Unexpectedly, Edward said his vows without fully understanding what he was saying, and was still perplexed. He claimed that everything appeared to float about him, including Eleanor's image. He could not stop thinking about her face exposed. He had anticipated marrying a frail and obedient woman, but instead he discovered a whole other person who had a presence he could not specify. When the prince led his new bride out of the room after the ceremony, going along the hall and into the royal chambers, where a reception honoring the new meanwhile, the courtiers murmured to one another, and interested eyes followed Eleanor everywhere. Many of them were as confused by the prince's portrayal of the enigmatic and ostensibly unattractive princess that everyone had previously thought appeared to be an even bigger mystery within the reception area where quiet music played, and as the visitors started to take their seats, Edward remained uneasy and stood close to Eleanor, yet he felt nervous with her because he wasn't sure what to say or do. And he experienced a mix of interest and mild annoyance at his inability to manage the greetings. "You appear taken aback by what your Highness Eleanor said abruptly." Although she didn't sound playful, there was a subtle yet nuanced tone to her Edward's face, flushed as he gazed at her, wondering how she could talk so composedly, as though she didn't realize how confused she had made the gossip. He started picking his words carefully, and they said a variety of things. I was surprised to see Eleanor smile a little without seeming irritated by the reports. "Have their own lives, Prince." She looked around, and I didn't care what they said. The room where her people's gaze kept following her, which they always choose to trust. In Edward, was even more intrigued by her response, which they don't know. Not only although Eleanor was lovely, there was a depth to her speech that made him comprehend what he was dealing with. He was disturbed by a woman who didn't fit any of the stereotypes he had ever encountered. "Why are you always the Eleanor?" continued to grin as he inquired directly, but her eyes became brighter. "Shine as those the way she waiting for this inquiry, since people define me based on what they observe, and I prefer to preserve some mysteries that the veil has protected me from that." She paused and looked directly at me. "However, there are no veils with you, Edward, and I don't want her around." Sincerity disarmed him, and he was unsure of how to respond to the prince's constant felt uncomfortable in front of a woman who didn't seem to be afraid by her and who seemed to have no fear position or based on the glances she received. Edward, who had never anticipated finding he was starting to understand that this arranged marriage might be more complicated than he had previously thought. Never would you have thought that the following few days would be as hectic as the castle's usual changed when Eleanor arrived, and the public responded inquisitively and admiringly. To the new princess, but many people were still curious about the veil and its mystery. Others viewed Eleanor as a strong, intelligent woman who was composed but stubborn. Manner started to win people over, but Edward the Enigma thought Eleanor signified only increased, and he found himself silently observing her in an attempt to comprehend what lay behind that assured look and that unbreakable composure. Eleanor took part in the councils with his ministers. A keen mind that made unexpected recommendations. She wasn't a passive princess, and one evening after a while, this both annoyed and captivated the prince. During a particularly contentious discussion concerning the new trade deals, Vener Edward chose to confront her, saying, "You're not at." When they were by themselves in the apartments, he spoke in a voice that was full of, "How can I trust someone I don't even know? How can I deal with this frustration?" Eleanor gave him a composed gaze, not displaying astonishment or alarm, but rather appearing ready for that. "Well, and what did you anticipate from a quiet princess who is prepared to comply, Edward?" She asked everything without inquiry, and I heard her calm, yet forceful voice. "If you wish to get to know me, you must acknowledge that I am more than just an ornamental wife. I am not a component in this game that you can move as you like." Edward, who was accustomed to having control over his life, was deeply affected by Eleanor's words. His court, his future. But Eleanor presented a fresh challenge that had withdrawn to this power, and always opposed depending on others. But he was also afraid of what it would indicate that he was not accustomed to being questioned in this manner, particularly by his own wife. He acknowledged that he was calmer now. "But I still want to know what to expect from you." After observing him for a while, Eleanor saw that his face softened and revealed a more vulnerable side. "I'm not your opponent, so start by listening to me under the mask of strength. I want to be your partner, Edward, but that will only work if you spend more time with me." Edward nodded more slowly than anticipated, sensing the gravity of what Eleanor had said, was giving him something more substantial, something genuine. And for the first time in years, the prince thought maybe he was confronted with an uncontrollable situation that had the potential to permanently alter his life. And as night fell, the kingdom Edward understood that his marriage, which had been so surprising and enigmatic, might be the start of a change, not only for him, but for everything he was familiar with during the days that, in a manner, the relationship between Edward and Eleanor was a meticulous dance that Edward was used to. Total control was starting to reveal that his wife wasn't a suitable PA. Managed, and Eleanor kept surprising him by remaining steadfast, stance and astute intellect, but gradually exposing a woman with more subtleties than Edward had ever seen. Fort Castle started to get used to Eleanor's presence in his imagined life at Wind. Through tacit displays of leadership and strategic acumen, he gained the respect of the kingdoms. At first, many advisors were dubious about a princess from a far-off realm that was only known by rumors. However, she demonstrated at every encounter that she was far more than the whispers had implied Edward was. Conflicted, yet continuing to do out his princely responsibilities with the same diligence as thoughts of Eleanor were continuously bothering him. And he pondered how a woman who had been characterized as odd and peculiar may have so much depth. Her beauty was now merely, what else was she concealing one evening when the castle was part of the mystery? Quiet. Edward felt that marriage was more than just a political alliance. Therefore, he made the decision to try to get to know his wife better. Might be a genuine collaboration, something he had never thought about for himself. There was something about Eleanor that drew him in and made him realize something. Discovered her by herself in the library, reading an old book from the kingdom under the gentle glow of the candles. Lighted her face, and for a brief while, Edward silently observed her as if so engrossed in her world, so unlike any other woman he had ever encountered. Didn't realize you enjoyed reading? He added, as he walked slowly toward Eleanor, who looked up, eh? She said, "There are many things you don't know about me, Edward," with a tiny smile on her lips, before closing the book. Gently, and I believe you've already noticed that he sat down and nodded. Beside her, but unsure of how to start, I discovered he acknowledged. To be honest, I won't deny that initially I believed our marriage would be merely a formality, akin to a political alliance. There have been a lot of people before you, but you're really different from what I anticipated. Eleanor gave him a close look, as though determining how much to divulge from. I realized I would need to be more than simply a decorative element as soon as I learned I would marry you, Edward. Princess, I arrived from Venor with the idea of fortifying that alliance, sure, but also to be. She hesitated and maintained a steady glance. But that won't work. Unless you want to know me. Edward briefly observed her, recognizing that this was the pivotal moment when he desired to know her and comprehend this woman's identity. She simultaneously seemed to challenge and appeal to him. And what do you want me to know? He questioned. Sincerely, Eleanor gave me a gentle grin as though she had been anticipating this inquiry. Want you to know that I was brought up to be far from the standards of a typical court in Venor. Powerful, but I've also always had to conceal aspects of who I am. As you can see by the veil I wore, people prefer to believe in stories and rumors, wanted to conceal not only my appearance but also who I truly am. Her eyes glowed with a blend of sorrow and defiance. But I don't want to conceal anything from you. Edward felt constricted, and when he heard her words, he realized that he had long undervalued the breadth of his own existence. He had been raised to meet his father's expectations and was always ready to govern the kingdom. But had he started to see that he had never let himself be vulnerable enough to be anything other than the "I understand" Crown Prince, he said softer than he had. As anticipated, I suppose I've also been hiding behind a facade for a while, Eleanor. She saw him for the first time and heard the sincerity in his comments. The prince genuinely relaxed, and she saw an opportunity for the first time to develop a sincere relationship. So why don't we start over, she proposed. She spoke in a stern yet slightly hopeful tone, without any veils or archaic. Edward nodded, sensing the weight of her words. Expectations. Just you and me. He felt both anxious and excited at the prospect of beginning anew, and genuinely attempting to create something with Eleanor. And excitement. But he also understood that it wouldn't be simple, because there was a lot of... He still didn't understand her, and he had a sneaking suspicion that Eleanor had secrets she wasn't prepared to share. After a few weeks, Edward invited Eleanor to spend more time with him. She to political gatherings, and, as their discussions grew more intimate over dinners, he started to admire her wisdom, her understanding of the kingdom, and even her capacity to handle the most challenging situations. Advisors Eleanor, however, appeared to become more at ease around Edward. sharing aspects of herself that she had hitherto remained concealed. But things weren't all peaceful. Many people in court were still distrustful of Eleanor and questioned her genuine character as stories persisted. Abrupt ascent to power, and Edward himself, although growing more enthralled with his wife, was aware of something more profound, but she kept it from him. He sensed that underneath her calmness was a tale that it was an autumn evening when the wind was blowing, and Eleanor wasn't quite ready to share it yet. As they proceeded, Edward stated, "Blowing hard through the castle walls that I finally decided to confront her, Eleanor. I respect your personal space, but I feel like you haven't told me anything yet via the moonlit gardens. Genuinely going to be partners. I must know what you're concealing," she said, pausing her pace to turn to face him. Was an unreadable flash of grief and resolve in her eyes. "You're right, Edward," she said. "There's something I haven't told you yet," in a low, nearly whispery voice. Edward waited, sensing something about me and about Venner, and he was going to learn the truth about why Eleanor had been hiding behind a veil for so long, and the secret that the cool autumn wind blowing through Fort's gardens and rustling the parched leaves may alter everything between them. The prince sensed that something that would change was in the air between Edward and Eleanor. After Eleanor's revelation, there seemed to be an endless stillness, and he knew he was going to. Eleanor inhaled deeply as she heard the truth that was concealed behind the veil, and that she had been concealing from the start. As though preparing for something challenging, her once confident and enigmatic gaze now showed a mute suffering, as though the burden of that secret had followed her all of her life. "I was raised in a venerable family as part of a royalty who never really welcomed me," she said in a quiet, forceful voice. "At the beginning of when I was young, people used my presence and appearance to condemn me, saying I wasn't the kind of princess they were expecting, since I lacked the tenderness that other princesses have. And many saw that as a weakness." Edward listened carefully, as his chest constricted. It seemed odd to think that someone with such dignity and strength could have received such treatment. Became a shield, and Eleanor kept staring at the garden's shadowy horizon, which I concealed behind it. So it was simpler to let people think what they wanted as I grew, because I wouldn't have to deal with the critical glances. What should have been a straightforward decision about beauty turned into a symbol as an adult. And when the marriage to you was Edward, felt cold, as the veil was set up to act as a barrier, shielding me from what was about to happen. He considered her tale. He was aware of the high standards expected of royalty. Yet, he never realized the extent to which it could do harm to someone. And now more than ever, he wanted to know everything there was to know about Eleanor. "But Edward," she said. Her emotionally charged voice interrupted his thoughts, saying, "There's a bigger reason I went into hiding, and I need you." I'm here to be ready to hear Edward nod while softly holding her hand. "I want to know everything, Eleanor, and we'll deal with it." Eleanor inhaled deeply, her eyes gleaming with a mix of terror and resolve. The gusty wind appeared to increase the tension in the atmosphere. When I was born, a prophecy in veneer claimed that the next princess to ascend to the kingdom will bear. She carries a sinister destiny, a curse that might either bring about turmoil or deliver the now. My parents are terrified of this curse, and they think that my birth was connected to this old prophecy. Edward's eyes grew horrified. The concept appeared ridiculous in surprise, a curse. However, Eleanor's eyes made it clear to her how much my parents truly loved me. But they were constantly afraid of me, and she kept talking about the anguish in her voice. Felt that Vor's terrible destiny may be avoided if I wed a prince from a different realm, which is why the marriage was set up between us to save Venner Edward, and he felt the burden of he was given revelation that their marriage, which he had assumed to be only a political alliance, had far more for Velor. It was a question of survival, and an effort to shield the kingdom from something that Eleanor had endured, something that was both unknown and dreaded. Alone and concealed from everyone, she never really understood the meaning of the prophecy, expressed sorrow in her eyes, but terror overcame them, and ultimately, I turned into, when they sent me here to marry you, they believed the veil would conceal the fact that no one was a daughter but more of a Tau, would discover my true identity. Edward experienced a range of feelings on the one hand, rather than being about a strong, realistic lady, the story appeared fantastical, as though it were from an old legend. Who was in front of him? But he was unable to ignore Eleanor's suffering, and the weight she bore. Whether true or not, the curse had influenced Eleanor's life. Edward looked for words, but he was at a loss for words. I'm not sure if, despite my belief in curses, I also trust in you, and that Vor's dread has kept Eleanor, who had been her prisoner for too long, glanced at him with surprise, because she was accustomed to the way with distrust and anxiety. But even after learning about the curse, Edward seems more worried about her than it intended for the kingdom. And he declared, I will not allow this terrible destiny to rule our lives. Whatever your parents thought won't define who we are, he said firmly. You don't have to hide behind veils anymore, Eleanor. His comments moved me. For the first time, Eleanor felt liberated from something deep within herself. Not only from the curtain, but also from the deafening anticipation that had always been with her. And at that very moment, she realized that the man in front of her was someone she could finally spend time with. Not just a prince destined to govern. Thank you, Edward, she whispered softly, sharing her actual self. Edward shook, but be aware that by accepting this, you are also running the possibility of what my parents feared could occur. Whatever occurs, his head decided, you and I will confront it together, and I won't allow. What we are starting to construct is destroyed by prophecies or curses, and the wind seems to have quieted down, as though those words were coming from the castle itself. And despite all of their doubts and anxieties, Edward and Eleanor felt for the first time since their marriage that they could actually be partners in the days that followed the romance between Edward and Eleanor altered. Now that the secrets were public knowledge, the gap between them started to narrow, and Eleanor felt relieved of the weight. Of the veil and the curse started to further unravel, enabling Edward to identify her as a powerful, vulnerable, and brave. But at the same time, Fort Castle appeared to be about to undergo a significant event, and whispers of prophecy started to circulate, to spread among the nobility, and whispers of mistrust developed into apprehension of the mysteries, particularly in relation to old curses and prophecies, swiftly spread throughout the court Edward was familiar with. Worried, the trust he and Eleanor had been establishing may be destroyed if the kingdom learned the truth about the marriage. Ruined, and much worse, he was afraid that forces beyond of his control may appear to put their relationship and collaboration to the test. We're growing because, despite Edward's deep-seated denial of the existence of curses, he was aware that fate, which is always unpredictable, was about to throw him into situations that even he couldn't predict. With everything on the line, Windfort's tension grew daily as whispers of Eleanor's curse throughout the once, a representation of stability, The castle was now encircled by a climate of mistrust and anxiety. As rumors that the princess might bring a sinister destiny to the kingdom increased, many were. Despite having told her secret, Eleanor started to stare at her tiredly. Even among her own slaves, Edward was burdened by the court's mistrust. Observed sly looks as discussions were cut off when she walked into a room. Despite the fact that she and Edward were closer than ever, the prophecy's shadow seemed to loom large over them. As they started to construct together, Edward was committed to shielding his bride from the curse. Of Venner, even if he was surrounded by mystery, did not worry him, because he was convinced that the prince was aware that his own choices, not those of old stories, would determine the fate of his realm. That if he wanted to keep the peace in Windfort one day during a council meeting, he would have to move fast. The nobility were seated around a long table, talking about recent military movements when Edward made the decision to publicly address the matter. Movements in nearby countries, but the councilor's environment was hostile, and Eleanor's Prince Edward's name lingered like an imperceptible presence, although it was felt by everybody. With his strong voice, one of the eldest advisors, Lord Gavin, broke the silence. Beyond military issues, there are other topics that require discussion. Edward already arched an eyebrow. Lord Gavin, the advisor, peered around the room, waiting to see what would happen next. Room as though looking for assistance in front of the other nobles before speaking. He stated that the court is unhappy and that there are rising worries regarding Princess Eleanor. We are aware that the tales of an old Velor curse are merely hearsay, yet the people are starting to worry, and the other counselors gave a mute nod, seemingly had been anticipating this moment. Edward experienced a wave of rage, but he managed. He was aware that he could exacerbate the matter if he lost his temper. Instead, he said firmly, "I know you're worried, but let me clarify. Princess Eleanor. There is no place for legends of curses and prophecies involving my wife and your future queen. They are unfounded rumors in this council." Lord Gavin paused for a pause before responding with the utmost deference. "Your Highness, these legends produced agitation among the populace. We cannot overlook this. The confidence of the people and the court in a kingdom is what keeps it afloat. Start to fear the queen herself. These are not legends." Edward used more force than he had to break the silence. Eleanor has demonstrated her allegiance. So, if there's anything to be afraid of, it's the divide these stories may produce. If anyone here is unsure about her brilliance, she's already made a substantial contribution to the affairs of the kingdom. Her skills allowed them to talk, but the ensuing quiet was so stifling that none dared to oppose Edward directly. But the counselors could sense the tension in the air and understood the prince was committed to keeping his wife safe. By the end of the meeting, their confidence was still being undermined by their fear of the unknown. As the stories were spreading and Edward exited the room, he felt the weight of his obligation double the prophecy. Like a silent storm, and he was aware that calming the court would require more than just words. Edward and Eleanor conversed that evening while the wind screamed outside the castle. Chambers was aware that the counselors' meeting had been tense, and she could see the fatigue starting to in Edward's perspective. The strain of upholding the kingdom's order and preserving their bond was. He sat down and stated plainly, "It's beginning to take a toll. The council is divided. They continue to cling to these absurd rumors next to her by the fire, are terrified, and fear weakens people." Eleanor stared silently for a while. "Edward, you are aware that these rumors will not be easily dispelled," stated in a calm yet serious tone that she was afraid of the unknown. "People flourish on it. I've been surrounded by it all my life, and now I feel the burden of As Edward looked at her, his heart tightened because he detested witnessing the suffering in that plague that was sweeping the kingdom. I don't believe in Eleanor's eyes, knowing that she would still be the one most impacted, even if he denied the allegations. Taking Eleanor's hand, he cursed her. Yet if something was about to happen, if this prophecy is accurate, we shall confront it together. You are not alone. Despite her gentle smile, Eleanor had a knowing look in her eyes. Despite her faith in Edward, she felt that the storm was more intense than she was expressing. Vor's prophecy, which was only getting started around her, was more than a tale. It was a shadow that had accompanied her since birth and appeared to be influencing everyone in her immediate vicinity. But quick footsteps and heated voices reverberated through the castle halls before he could react. As soon as the voices reached a guard, who was panting, appeared at the chamber door. The guard's highness cried out in panic, obviously worried about something that had occurred close. The villagers claim that something sinister has appeared in the area surrounding the castle. Edward rose up instantly, his leader instinctively, while Eleanor's heart froze. He asked, "What happened?" as he snatched up his sword and got ready to pursue the guard. "There have been rumors of a dark. The village's crops have started to wither, due to the mist falling on them, and the residents are terrified. They said that the guard's words hung in the air, signaling the start of the Vork curse." Edward glanced at Eleanor, who was pale, but it felt like a punch to the stomach. She stood up and said, "Determined, I'll go with you." Edward instantly responded, "If you should stay here since it's unsafe," but Eleanor shook her head. "Edward, I'm adamant that I can't conceal much longer if this is connected to the prophecy. I must confront it head on, since it is my life." Edward nodded unwillingly, knowing that he couldn't prevent Eleanor from doing, particularly when they got about to depart the area, since everything appeared to be related to the mystery surrounding his existence. Castle. It seems that the dark mist that shrouded the village was only the beginning. Both Edward and Eleanor's futures, and Weefor's fate, were on the verge of something far bigger than each of them. They might have predicted Vor's curse, whether it was genuine or only a fear-induced. The night was darker than ever, as the truth was about to come to light. Then, an omen of despair was carried by the wind that blew over Windfort. Edward and Eleanor fled the fortress with a small contingent of guards, making their way to the village where the black fog had materialized. The guards' tales. This appeared unreal, yet they both knew deep down that this was the first concrete example of Vor's old Eleanor, was next to Edward as they rode, and the sound of their hooves hitting the ground reverberated like a funeral thud. She understood that her thoughts were a flurry of obligations and anxieties. Unrest has been brought about by arriving in the kingdom, and now that the crops are being destroyed by the black mist and the people, the prophecy started to appear very real. Could this be her parents' curse? Edward maintained his eyes on her, wondering if she was indeed destined to bring about devastation. His mouth was clenched, and although he didn't think curses existed, he shuddered when he saw Eleanor's terrified eyes. He wanted to shield her from every danger, but how could he shield someone from an unseen danger? Something that appeared in the night's darkness and the wind's whispers. When they eventually arrived at the village, a dense, gloomy fog made the picture much more bleak than they had anticipated, covered the homes and fields so densely that it was hard to see the once thriving area beyond than a few feet. The villagers were gathering in dead and rotting crops that appeared to have been drained of vitality by something. What transpired here left several of them pale-faced and terrified. Edward questioned as he dismounted his horse and went over to an elderly peasant who was shaking with, "The mist suddenly came over us last night, Your Highness, and we stammered in fright. Everything quickly started to wither, with some animals becoming sick and crops dying. I have no idea what's going on, but everyone claims that it's the curse of Edward." Felt a chill go down his spine as the name of the curse was uttered with such terror. Venner. The weight of guilt started when he glanced at Eleanor, who was standing next to him and observing the spectacle with serious eyes, to develop within her, but she resisted. Eleanor remarked, "I'd like to see where the fog began." Edward looked at her and saw that I was determined to understand what was happening. He waved to the guards in appreciation of her bravery, despite her dread. They reached the areas where the fog appeared to be heaviest, signaling that they should move carefully together. When they arrived at the location of the mist's genesis, Eleanor sensed an odd sensation in the air, as though someone invisible. The cold was sharp, there were forces, and the darkness felt heavier. There, as though to the ground. One of the guards said, scanning the area, "This is strange. Itself were cursed." Eleanor bent down suspiciously and touched the ground with her fingertips. Something was in the earth, a vibration that was somehow related to her, but that she was unable to describe. She felt a crushing weight on her soul, and her heart was racing. What if the curse was? What if, as Eleanor Edwards said, her presence was actually bringing about the end of the kingdom? With a worried tone in his voice, he observed her closely and saw that something was distinct about her. She stood staring at the fog, and for a little period she appeared preoccupied with her own thoughts. But then her face stiffened, and she gazed at looking at Edward resolutely. If this is an indication of the curse, then something, or she inhaled deeply, realizing that this was more than just a legend, is taking place, and we must identify it before it spreads throughout the realm. Edward agreed, understanding that was correct, that the curse existed, regardless of whether a supernatural force or something more concrete had to be stopped, and whomever was responsible had to be identified. When they got back to the castle that evening, the atmosphere was heavy before more damage happened. To loom over the village, and terror had taken hold, even though there were no additional indications of death or immediate devastation. In the main hall of the castle, Edward summoned the nobles and villagers to a meeting that went deep into their thoughts. He knew he couldn't manage this problem alone, and now more than ever, he needed to meet urgently with his counselors. He required everyone's assistance, and the advisors' looks were worried as we need answers, and everyone is gathered around the big oak table. Edward started examining. What transpired in the village cannot be disregarded by any of the men present. We must determine whether this odd occurrence is connected to the old prophecy of Venor, or if there is Lord Gavin, who had always been the master of forces beyond of our control, was unconvinced of Eleanor. He warily accepted the word, "Your Highness, if I may." Started picking his words carefully, and we can't deny that Princess, this darkness began when Eleanor was present. Albeit I'm not saying that she is the reason, but it's possible that something in Velor has brought this to our realm. Eleanor stood next to Edward, kept quiet, but her eyes were burning with resolve, because she knew she would be the suspicion target. But she refused to let fear define who she was. She simply said, "I understand your concerns, Lord Gavin," unmoved by the suggestions, "but I can guarantee you that if there is anything venerable, I am not accountable for this darkness. Whatever is showing up here, we must recognize it. And we are powerless to Edward nodded in agreement with Eleanor that despite our differences, we urgently need unity. Vor's curse is being used against us by someone or something, and we cannot allow fear separates us. He turned to face Lord Gavin, asking, "Now is not where." Despite the tension, the board agreed on how we would halt it, to carry out the probe, but the prophecy's weight continued to hang over everyone. And Edward was aware that the country was on the verge of greater disaster. Time was running out, and the black mist was only the Eleanor started to feel uneasy as she got ready for bed that evening. The curse that had lain dormant for so long was suddenly weighing heavily on her, and she felt more than ever that her own past was connected to the destiny of the kingdom. As she lay next to Edward, who was already asleep, she gazed at the room's ceiling, her mind racing with ideas about how could she combat something that felt so much larger than everything, and was this darkness that followed her every step. She was aware that she had heard a whisper amid the night's silence. Eleanor heard a slight sound like the wind, but it conveyed a clear message, and she swiftly sat up. Rushing, the faraway, icy voice was distinct, and then the whisper. Eleanor felt a shiver go down her spine when destiny called you. The whisper appeared to originate in her own thoughts, as though the curse was finally showing up inside of her. Whatever was going on, knew she had to confront it. And this time, Eleanor, fate was headed directly for her. The whispers continued to reverberate in her thoughts as she sat in the darkness, feeling cold. Wasn't just the darkness around the castle. It was something more sinister, the thing she had been afraid of. Her life was finally coming to an end, and she recognized the prophecy when she heard her name in those ethereal voices. Eleanor, destiny calling you was becoming a reality, and those words appeared to originate from the whisper, is present everywhere, and simultaneously emanating from his own spirit. Persisted, as though it were drawing her away, she gazed at Edward, who slept comfortably next her, had a calm face, but was worn out from the struggles and obligations that had accumulated over the previous 3 days. And she realized she couldn't just sit there and figure out what was going on remaining on the sidelines, in the hopes that things would resolve themselves if the Ellen either had to learn how to cope with the curse or it was actually tied to her. She sighed as she rose from the bed, taking care not to wake Edward, who hastily put on a thick cloak and left the chamber quietly as she made her way through the shadowy hallways of the Whispers Castle. Seemed to increase in volume, as though the enigmatic voice were directing Eleanor. Trailed the whispers until she arrived inside the castle's historic library, which was hardly accessed. Outside of the location was obscured by scholars or advisors who felt compelled to disparage old documents. Upon entering, she sensed a gloomy atmosphere illuminated by a few nearly extinguished lamps. Weight in the air as though time itself were suspended there, and she was aware that something that contained the secret to comprehending the curse walking was concealed within those walls for a reason. Eleanor came to an area where the oldest history books were stored between the dusty shelves. Few people could understand the old languages used to write mythology and legends. Therefore, suddenly, she saw one book in particular. It appeared worn with tattered edges, aged, but the leather cover featured symbols that she was familiar with. Eleanor took the book from the shelf and carefully opened it, her hands shaking as she did so. The pages were yellowed and written in an old language that she was familiar with, her forefathers' language. She discovered what she was looking for as she jumped the ranks. Book, a chapter on the curse of Venner. When the moon rises over the far-off kingdom, a shadow will appear along with the air of respect. The princess will control fate and present the options of annihilation. Or Eleanor felt a sense of rescue. Those who fear her would lose everything, but those who believe will discover a hidden strength. The crisp words sent a shiver down her spine, and she now realized why her existence had always been feared by her parents and society. The curse was more than simply an upheaval forecast, but she would have to make the decision alone. Was meant to determine Venner's and Windfort's fate, but what did choice? How could he determine which was the correct course before she did? And would it result in devastation or salvation? Dig any farther into the texts. She turned swiftly as she heard footsteps echoing throughout the library. Edward stood in the doorway, his eyes anxious and her heart pounding. "Eleanor, what's going on?" He was perplexed to see her there by herself in the middle of the night, holding the ancient book. He said, "I woke up and you weren't there," as he approached her. Something had occurred, and after a little pause, Eleanor decided she could. "I believe I have the solution, Edward. I will no longer keep the truth from him." He spoke calmly about what was happening, but you could see the panic in his eyes. Everyone fears the curse of Venner, yet it's not as real as people believe. It's a decision, not a doomsday scenario. Edward scowled. "I understand," she groaned. "What do you mean?" "The prophecy states that I bring a choice to the situation," and she gripped the book tightly as though it kept her grounded. "Kingdom, of which I am the focal point, Edward, and I have the power to either salvation, but I'm not sure how to decide that or what's right." For a minute, Edward remained mute as she explained that his wife, the fate of two kingdoms rested on the shoulders of the woman with whom he had started a genuine partnership, was challenging to accept, but he also understood that he could not ignore the reality. Finally, he said, "You don't have to make this choice alone," in Eleanor's eyes. "Whatever it is, I have faith in you, Eleanor. And if there is a choice, we will face it together." Told him, "You'll make the right one." Her eyes were filled with Eleanor experienced emotion for the first time in a long time, realizing that she was not carrying her load alone. Edward had faith in her, and that exceeded her expectations. "Thank you, Edward," she added, voice breaking. "I'm simply worried about making the wrong decision and what I might bring." Rather than offering salvation, Edward came to her and grasped her hands, while gazing into her eyes with a toughness that gave her a sense of strength. "I think you were created to save, not to obliterate. You have already contributed more to this world than any curse could. Together, we'll learn what that means." Eleanor grinned, feeling hopeful swell within of her, but she felt in her heart that there was still more to be. Time was running out, as evidenced by the whispers and the darkness that were starting to engulf the realm. She had to be prepared for the next morning's wind fort, since the decision the prophecy mentioned was drawing near. Awoke to a sky full of ominous clouds. The fog that had been contained before gradually but steadily moved toward the castle walls from the village, creating a tense atmosphere. Many individuals started to worry that the worst was still to come, as Edward and Eleanor. There was a sense of urgency around the castle, as everyone was ready to face whatever happened next. Messengers were dispatched to the allied kingdom to request assistance, and defenses were strengthened. But everyone knew in their hearts that since in the end, the actual war would take place inside Eleanor's own soul. rather than with swords and shields. Her decision would determine the fate of everyone. The dark mist slowly ascended the wind-swept walls of Fort Castle. The air was tense and silent, like an unavoidable shadow that threatened to engulf everything in its path. A prophecy that hovered like a specter above the kingdom seemed to have everyone holding their breath, waiting to see how it would turn out. Inside the castle, their hearts pounded with doubt, and the burden of the morning had gone over to a dreary day when faith fell on a lone woman, Eleanor. Clouds in the sky promised not to rain, but Edward and Eleanor were ready for something much worse: the unavoidable conflict with the unseen forces occupying the kingdom, rather than with actual adversaries. The ancient prophecies seemed to reverberate throughout the castle, and Eleanor could feel it in every strand of her body. Holding Eleanor's hands, Edward continued, "I want you to stay here because the moment of choice is about to arrive." Tightly, his worried gaze. "Let me and the guards deal with this." "I don't want." Eleanor touched Edward's face and smiled tenderly, telling him not to put himself in danger. Gently, she understood that he wanted to keep her safe. But she also understood that she had the power to decide how she would fight the struggle that lied ahead, would have to make the prophecy of Venner, which could not be delayed or avoided, has followed her throughout her life, and now I can no longer escape from her. Edward stated firmly and quietly that this was greater than the two of us, greater than any conflict we might engage in with swords. I must confront what lies ahead. Edward gazed at her with a mix of pride and agony, knowing he could make the decision that was meant for me. Not stop her, since he was aware that Eleanor was his partner and equal, not just a sheltered princess. Furthermore, a lady who was meant to bear the weight of a prophecy that she had not selected, but that now applied to her obligation to confront. "I'll stand by your side," he said, his eyes brimming with Eleanor agreed, feeling an unwavering commitment to tackle whatever comes our way together. With Edward by her side, she developed inner strength and thought she could handle anything. Came, but she knew in her heart that she would be the only one to make the ultimate choice. As the mist that had shrouded the village moved closer to the castle doors, fearful citizens sought sanctuary within the walls. And even though the troops were armed, they knew they would not engage in combat. The surrounding trees appeared to wither in the face of a physical foe as the mist's gloom spread, consuming life. When the fog eventually arrived at the castle gates, the air was filtered from everything it touched, became dense and unbreathable, giving the impression that time was standing still. Advisors and nobles surrounding Eleanor and Edward in the great hall, silently observing them while they awaited direction for a miracle. All of a sudden, the enormous front gate flew open, and a blast of cold air, whispers, the same voice as Eleanor had, came running into the castle with the wind, heard the previous nights, but now that Eleanor Destiny is here, it's louder and clearer. Her pulse pounded as she had to make a decision, but something inside. She stayed composed, since she understood that now was the time when the prophecy's fate had predicted that the mist before her was not merely an expression of fear, but also like a shadow, the living force, an entity that required the decision that Venner had foreseen. A creature emerged from the mist's depths, a hooded entity covered in. He moved slowly toward the darkness, his eyes gleaming with an eerie light. His appearance in the middle of the hall caused complete silence, and everyone stared in wonder. But no, the entity declared in a voice that if anyone attempted to approach Princess Eleanor of Venor, it appeared to echo from all directions at once that the moment had arrived to fulfill you are doomed to bear the curse that your forefathers feared. The kingdom is on the Eleanor rushed forward, with the feeling that she was on the verge of ruin, and that only you could decide whether to save or destroy, the burden of accountability on her shoulders. But she also had an odd clarity that regarded the cloaked figure, aware that it was the embodiment of Vor's own curse, an old force that wanted a decision. And she inquired in a firm voice what the decision was. In spite of the creature reached out, and the mist surrounding him shifted as though it were living, causing the fear that attempted to settle in her chest to subside. "Give up everything," he murmured in a deep, low voice. "Can choose destruction. The kingdom will be sacrificed. The curse's power will be destroyed by your blood. The prophecy will come to pass, and Valor will no longer bear the weight it has for millennia," Eleanor thought, feeling cold. Gave her soul for the kingdom, looking at Edward, her advisors, and everyone else. Who trusted her? How could she have made such a decision? The alternative option in an attempt to maintain composure, the hooded figure SM grinned a wicked smile that provided no consolation. Salvation requires self-sacrifice. You must confront the shadows within you and accept the curse's power. If you do, you might be able to save honor and win Fort, but the cost will be eternal, and you will never be the same. Eleanor's breath briefly caught in her throat as she realized that salvation would be her own essence. She would save the realm, but at the expense of changing and losing her identity. Something influenced by the curse. And when she turned to face Edward, her eyes were filled with unshed tears. He saw that she was upset, and he moved forward to meet her. "Whatever you decide, I'll be by your side," he added in a quiet, heartfelt voice. "Love, but keep in mind that, Eleanor, you are and always have been strong. Don't let fear get to you. Govern your actions." She briefly closed her eyes and mustered the strength to, now that it wasn't a question of life or death. She had a simple choice. Eleanor had always known who she wanted to be and who she had always been. She revealed that the curse was a test, rather than merely a sinister prophecy. "I chose salvation, but not at the expense of losing," she said, her eyes and voice echoing loudly across the hall. The cloaked figure appeared to pause, as though his comments had taken him by surprise. "I will confront and overcome the curse, even if it destroys me. Neither Wind nor Venner will die without losing my essence if there is a..." The mist in the hallway started to stir. "But I'm willing to pay the price, on my own terms, aggressively, as though an unseen power were attempting to thwart Eleanor's decision. But she remained steadfast, feeling the depth of Edward's love as she held his hand. The cloaked figure abruptly vanished as the darkness engulfed it. The thick air hanging over the castle started to lighten, as the fog itself started to gradually disappear. The silence was... A communal sigh of relief took its place, and Eleanor collapsed on her knees, fatigued. Yet she made her decision, and had one with a great sense of relief in her chest. "You did it, Eleanor," Edward said in a whisper, as he knelt next to her and held her in his arms. She grinned, her eyes gleaming with pride, and at last, tears began to fall down her cheeks. Together, they were able to save the kingdom of Windfort and Venner, and the curse was lifted. That had long plagued their forebears was at last dispelled. The gloom had been debunked, and the ancient prophecy had been defeated by Edward's love and Eleanor's strength. Eleanor realized at that moment that real strength was in facing destiny with bravery and without losing herself.